Awesome. Okay. Thank you so much for everybody for joining us for our final presentation of the school year regarding supporting students with disabilities in post-secondary education. And so we're really focusing on the transition from high school or 18 to 21 programs to a post-secondary environment, and what that means as far as law goes, what that means as far as support, roles and responsibilities, even what is the parent's role now. So we're going to dive into some good stuff tonight. So I'm really excited for that. We have three presenters this evening. Myself, my name is Julia Gorman. I am the Assistant Director of the Educational Access Center at Boise State. So I work with students to establish accommodations in their courses. And then I also do some support programming for our students, for our autistic students on campus. And then I also get to do some community and campus outreach efforts, such as this one tonight. And I'll let Erin introduce herself.
Hello, everyone. I'm Erin Sutton. I'm the Assistant Director for the Center for Disability Access and Resources at the University of Idaho. I also do a lot of the same things Julia said. So working with students to establish accommodations for their courses. I also work with our students on the autism spectrum in our Raven Scholars Program, doing some case management this semester. And also just participating in outreach efforts locally and through the state of Idaho to present various events. And I'll give it over to Jamie.
Hi, everyone. My name is Jamie, and I'm a graduate assistant, and I work with the EAC with Julia at Boise State University. And I'm also a part of the TRIO ACES program, which stands for Academic Coaching and Educational Support. So I meet one-on-one with students, and we work on skill development, like time organizing, procrastination, perfectionism, all those kinds of skills, just working on those, as well as advocating for them and connecting them with their EAC coordinator for the accommodation piece.
Awesome. Thanks, ladies. So you heard us introduce, we are from the Educational Access Center and Center for Disability Access and Resources, EAC and CEDAR for short. Our office's purpose is to support students with disabilities on our campuses. So we are disability resource centers. Now, we are not special to Boise State and University of Idaho. Disability resource centers or resource offices exist at almost all post-secondary institutions. The good rule of thumb is that if the school accepts federal funding, if students are FAFSA eligible when they go to the school, then they have to provide accommodations. And when we talk about accommodations, really the purpose of those is to reduce and remove barriers to the student's academic experience. And when we talk about disability, we talk about permanent and temporary disabilities. So permanent disabilities, meaning learning disabilities, mental health related needs, neurodivergence, physical disabilities, students who may be deaf or hard of hearing, have blind or low vision. And so a wide variety of students. And then temporary, such as concussions, or maybe they broke their wrist going down the slopes over winter break. So we work with a wide variety of students. And again, the information that we're sharing tonight, we may share personal anecdotes from each of our universities, but overall, this information is going to be applicable in the transition process for really any post-secondary institution who has a disability services office. As you have questions, feel free to throw them in the chat, and we're going to have time at the end as well. So I will throw it over to Jamie.
All right, so we're going to talk about some legal rights and responsibilities when it comes to post-secondary education. So the first slide is about what is the difference between high school and 18 to 21-year-old programs to post-secondary education. So with high school, student rights are protected by the IDEA. So that focuses on K-12 education and education rights, whereas post-secondary education, student rights are protected by ADA. So that's more accessibility rights. And so again, in high school, schools use IEPs and 504s, and then in post-secondary education, accommodation letters are used. And we look at IEPs and 504s, but that's not our determining factor. Accommodation letters and what the student tells us is what is really what is used. And then in high school, guarantees success in post-secondary education, just ensuring equitable access through reasonable accommodations. Again, in high school, school identifies the students and initiates those services, where in post-secondary education, the student has to identify themselves, what accommodations have worked for them and what hasn't worked for them, to the school's Disability Services Center. And then in high school, the school organizes and provides updated testing, where post-secondary education, the student is responsible for updated testing documentation if needed. And then in high school, parents/families are typically highly involved. Post-secondary education, parents/families only have access to what the student allows. The student can fill out an ROI if that's needed, but really it's up to the student at that point. And then in high school, decisions about the student's education are made by their school team. And then in post-secondary education, decisions about the student's education are made by the student themselves, that individual. And then rights and responsibilities. Maybe.
Not sure why it's not showing when I go to full screen. So Jamie, if you can just read it like this,
Okay.
that would work great.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah. So the first one is post-secondary institutions. So they have the right to set admission, academic, and conduct standards, but they are responsible for providing reasonable and appropriate access to all classes, programs, activities, facilities, services, things like that. And then also disability services that most all campuses have. They have the right to maintain the institution's academic standards, require documentation of a disability, establish documentation guidelines, and then they're responsible for establishing policies, procedures for requesting and implementing accommodations, and then determining appropriate accommodations for students with disabilities. And then the next one are professors and instructors. So they have the right to hold all students to the same academic standard. No student gets special privileges. All students have the same standards. But they are responsible for providing accommodations determined by Educational Access Center at Boise State or the disability services at that school. And then also maintaining confidentiality of students' accommodations and disability-related information, and then understanding students learn in different ways. And then students, so they have the right to equitable access to all classes, programs, facilities, activities. And then they also have the right to file a complaint if they feel that they have been treated unfairly. They are responsible for meeting institutional academic standards with or without accommodations, self-disclose to the EAC or to disability services, depending at what school you're at, in a timely manner that you are an individual with a disability and that you're requesting accommodations. And then follow procedures for obtaining accommodations, as well as requesting accommodations for each class every semester, because one accommodation is not going to be for every single class. Like for testing, if you need a testing accommodation, you wouldn't use a testing accommodation in an English class when that's more essay based. So each semester you have to request different accommodations. And then now we talk about the parent/the guardian's role. So in high school, parents must ensure that their child attends school. The parents have a lot more freedom within that realm. When it comes to college, parents are not required to send a student to college. And if the student does attend college, they are responsible for following attendance procedures. The student is, and parents don't really have much of a say at that point. And then in high school, periodic progress reports are given to parents. That doesn't happen in college. Teachers are free to approach parents without consent from student to discuss students' progress. That is what's done in high school. When it comes to college, an ROI needs to be signed by the student for parents to have access to educational information. That student has to allow that information to be released. In high school, the parent is the student's legal guardian. In college, the student holds their educational rights. They're an adult and they move on. Then in high school, the parent is expected to advocate for the student And then in college, the student is expected to advocate on their own behalf. So that's the difference between high school and college.
All right, thank you, Jamie. So now we're going to talk about the interactive process. So to start the process for receiving accommodations, you're first going to be admitted or enrolled in your desired post-secondary school. So you need to be accepted into school. And then you are going to find one of our offices. So for example, if you're going to Boise State or U of I, you're going to look for the EAC or CEDAR. And you're going to go to our webpage because we have one. And that's where you're going to find your application. So the application, I know for us, is pretty quick. You could probably fill it out in less than 20 minutes. It's just asking for your demographic contact information, the name of your disability or disabilities, describing how your disability impacts your learning, previous or desired accommodations, and then you have the ability to attach your documentation if you have that. And then once that application is completed, you'll get from our office, we give an email out saying, please give our office a call to schedule your meeting. And then you would call into our office, talk to our office manager, and schedule a meeting with one of our access consultants or coordinators, depending on what school you're at. So the interactive process, I think, is one of the most important parts of getting accommodations in post-secondary education. And so what that involves is it's typically myself or someone like Julia or an access consultant or coordinator in our office and the student. Sometimes the parent is in attendance, and that is, that is up to the student whether they want their parents to attend. So we listen to what the student's self-report is, right? So we get to have a conversation about what they're self-reporting in terms of disabilities or barriers. And then through that observation and interaction, we can kind of just see how they're speaking to us or how they're presenting. I'll use an example of like mental health, right? So if maybe they're like a little bit disheveled or they're having just someone who's experiencing some depression, right? They might come maybe not well kept, and that's something that we noticed during that. Maybe someone who's experiencing some anxiety, they might be a little fidgety or nervous. Maybe they're getting a little sweaty, so there's things that we take account for, physically or even over Zoom of what's going on during those interactions. And then that next piece is the information that we're receiving from external parties regarding their diagnoses, and that would be dependent on the disability, either medical records, reports, assessments created by healthcare providers. If they had an IEP in high school previously, it might be a eligibility evaluation. Some people call them a triennial report, or a psychoeducational report. They're called many different things, but we're looking for something like that that's going to fill in any gaps and just really let us see those diagnostic pieces that we need to be able to establish accommodations. The initial appointment. So the initial appointment is the interactive process. And obviously the interactive process can go beyond that initial appointment because accommodations are, as I like to say, fluid. They're not, once we establish them, that's not like what you get. So they're fluid, and it's all dependent on how you're going through your educational journey and what you need. So different barriers might come up as you're going along. So in the initial appointment, students should be prepared to discuss their disability and how it impacts them in the following areas. So academics, I always ask about how they feel about reading and writing and math. Those are my main three, those are our core subjects. So we want to hear about how they feel about all of those things. We also talk about how they take their notes, how they're able to attend to lectures, how they interact with their peers, how they would do during group projects. We talk about executive functioning and time management. any physical barriers or things with mobility. So it just really depends on what the student is self-reporting and what they are also requesting. Some students will put in requests in their applications, and so sometimes my questions will lead that way. And then also if we're talking about housing accommodations, we're looking over that really explicit documentation that's stating why they need their housing accommodations. And then we're also discussing, the need for whether it be accessible furniture, an ESA, maybe they're asking for a private room, things like that. So then also in the initial appointment, we are reviewing the documentation. And then if they don't have documentation, which is common sometimes, that's kind of, it can be common that they don't have documentation. And then I let them know where they can get documentation. So at U of I, we have a counseling and testing center. So if they, are coming in and they feel like they're struggling in reading as they got to post-secondary education, and they might feel like they have a learning disability, we go through this survey and I refer them to the counseling and testing center, and they can be assessed for a learning disability if they want. And that is a way that they can receive documentation. If they are struggling with mental health, like depression, anxiety, PTSD, something like that, we could hook them up with counseling through our CTC or, maybe just a local provider, and they can get documentation that way through the therapy and counseling process as well. During that initial appointment, we'll also discuss previous accommodations that they had possibly in high school or in community college and how that benefited them, what worked, what didn't work. And then this is their time for students to ask any questions. We ask a lot of questions of them, and I think it's really great. And the best initial appointments that I have are when that dialogue goes back and forth, because when students ask certain questions, it sometimes will lead me to my next question. And I don't usually have a recommendation, but sometimes it leads us access consultants or coordinators to recommendations that we could talk about and discuss. And kind of talking about recommendations, I know for me, I will never recommend something and then say, okay, we're going to put that in. It still has to be requested from that student. So I'll give them the option of like, it really sounds like you struggle with, and I hate that I'm using this example, but it's what's in my head right now. It sounds like you're really struggling with deadlines. And so we might need to put in an occasional 1 to 2 day extension. Is that something that you would be interested in? Or is that something that you think would be helpful? Or maybe it would work against you? Like, what are your thoughts? And so that's where we really want those students to be comfortable with talking about what works for them and what doesn't work for them. Yes, that's all I have. That slide, sorry. Went off on a tangent. Okay, and here we go. Potential questions during the interactive process. So here's some things that we could start with in high school. This would be a statement from a student. So in high school, I got double time on exams. So some clarifying questions that an access consultant or coordinator might ask would be, how does extra time help you? What do you experience related to your disability? So, some students might say, oh, I get really distracted by people around me. And so I really hyper focus on, pens clicking, people moving their backpacks. And I spend a lot of time having to like reassure myself and calm myself down or something like that, right? And then another example would be, I got copies of my teacher's notes. So we would ask a clarifying question of, how does that help you? What was the purpose of your teacher's notes? Maybe they say, I struggle with reading, and then we'll discuss if they had previously used any tools such as audiobooks. Maybe a comment like, I took tests in a separate room in high school. And then we would ask, well, why did you take a test in a separate room? And was it an issue of the classroom environment? So just being able to answer questions that are related to that would be really helpful to start prepping your high school students for now. And then going into prepping. So preparing students for the interactive process. So being a meaningful participant of their IEP or 504 team. I cannot stress this enough. I came from the high school setting. I was a resource teacher before, and I can say now that I'm in this position, I reflect on some of how much I didn't not force, but didn't encourage my students to participate in that IEP process more. I wish I would have, because I think they could have been better prepared for these type of meetings. And one thing that I've seen a local school district do is they're having their seniors present their last IEP. Like, so they stand up there, they're going through pretty much their whole IEP. And I think that's a great way for them to, one, you know, not a lot of people don't love to present. So they're having to really like look at the material and make sure that they understand, you know, why it is they had certain goals or why they had certain accommodations. And so I think that is a really valuable experience for those seniors that are presenting those IEPs. So I just wanted to share that little blip. But yeah, knowing their accommodations, acknowledging that their input and experience is valuable because it is about them. Their IEP is specifically for them. And I think that we kind of get caught up as an IEP team as like the parents and the teacher and maybe the school psych, they're running the show, but really the show is about that student. And so really empowering them to be part of that team. Giving students opportunities to talk about their accommodations with their teachers, evaluate and identify how they learn in different subject areas. I think that is really awesome when students can speak to like, oh, I really struggle in reading and writing. I have to use audiobooks. I definitely take longer to write essays. I know that I'm going to need an accommodation for that, or I'm going to have to hit up the writing center a lot more. But you know, math, I feel like I got it. These are some strategies I use in math. When students are able to speak that way, it makes the interactive process, I don't want to say easier, but it kind of does make it easier. And it makes it feel like I'm like, okay, I know what we're going to do for this student. And I feel like we're setting them up for, not setting them up for success, but setting them up for more success and removing more barriers by being able to establish that early on in their college career. And then learning opportunities for executive functioning, time management, organization. When I ask about executive functioning in the interactive process, the most common answer I get is horrible, terrible, awful. And so just really empowering students. I know that teenagers and young adults don't always love to use agendas or calendars, or they know that they can just keep it all in their head. But it is really nice to have that type of system established before getting to college, because it really helps them, I think, when things get overwhelming, to at least have that structure in place. Other learning opportunities for mindfulness, intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation, studying and test taking strategies, and note-taking techniques. And then some examples of documentation. This may vary from school to school, but it's pretty much the same. We're looking for that diagnostic piece. We get anything from an IEP, a 504, summary of performance, that 3-year reevaluation, so that eligibility evaluation, medical records, and psychological or psychoeducational evaluations. Yeah.
I just want to jump in really quick because I shared it in the chat too. This piece where it's like external documents will vary in relevance and value. I just want to reiterate, especially for students requesting housing accommodations, where that really comes into play. Typically, IEPs and even 3-year reevals are not sufficient for housing accommodations, because housing accommodations are very particular, and that documentation needs to specifically speak to the accommodation being requested. So for example, we couldn't use a 3-year reevaluation to justify an emotional support animal for a student, unless the student had an emotional support animal attending classes with them in public education, and the 3-year evaluation had that information in there, which rarely, if ever, happens. Service animals are different. They don't need documentation, but if it was an emotional support animal. And even then, that was class, not housing. So I just like to reiterate that piece. Sorry for jumping in.
Yes, total different ballgame when it comes to housing and accommodations. That documentation needs to be super explicit on why they need that accommodation, for sure.
All right. Erin says the interactive process is the most important piece, which is so true. I just really like talking about accommodations because I think accommodations still speak to the fact of what Erin mentioned, that the interactive process does not stop at the initial meeting. The interactive process is really our whole interaction and relationship with the student throughout their entire educational journey. As Jamie shared, students have various responsibilities, and sometimes, we are helping them understand those responsibilities, act those out, understand their rights, particularly in regards to accommodations. And so there's some key things to consider when remembering the shift of how their accommodations may have looked in high school, or their transition programs, and how they may now look. So first, a quick overview. So some do's and don'ts of accommodations, and I really want to focus on the do's. So accommodations really reduce and remove barriers to the experience. They are not changing what the student is doing in the course. They are acting as those supports or tools. They're reasonable and appropriate, and they depend on the class and class requirements. So I think Jamie had mentioned, typically students don't have testing accommodations in their English classes because the foundational English courses are writing only. There's no tests or quizzes to take. So the accommodation is not appropriate for the class if it's on extended time for tests. And they, again, that reasonable and appropriate piece, they're not changing what the student is doing. And so accommodations, when we look at IEPs and we have page 14 of 16 where it says accommodations listed, that's really what we're looking at, is that page 14 when we're talking about accommodations to be applicable in college, is what did they receive, what was effective, what was ineffective, and things that may modify course requirements, may modify what the student is doing, would not be appropriate in the college environment. Students have to meet the same learning outcomes. They have to take the same tests. Their process for taking that test, though, might just look a little different. For example, they may get extra time on it or take it in a private room. And some of these shifts in those accommodations, I think, are really portrayed here. And so on the left, we have examples of what students may currently receive. And on the right is what they may look like in post-secondary. So for example, number one, Kelsey has a designated peer she sits next to in math class. That peer takes notes for Kelsey and helps her with classwork when needed. So in the interactive process, let's say we meet with Kelsey and we'll ask her, okay, Kelsey, we see that you have this peer that you sit next to in math class. That peer takes notes for you and helps you with your coursework. Tell me more. Why did you need these different things? And when talking with Kelsey, we really find out in the interactive process, okay, taking notes for Kelsey, it's because Kelsey needed a copy of notes because maybe Kelsey has a learning disability that really impacts her math. Therefore, those multiple executive functioning skills of having to listen, write the notes down, pay attention, not miss information, might be really difficult for her comprehension in math. And so the note taking is a great tool. And then the peer that helps her, well, Kelsey needed a little bit of extra support. Maybe she received some specialized instruction as well with her IEP. And we know that specialized instruction is not an accommodation in college. So what Kelsey might receive in college is some note-taking tools or technology. So we might look into Kelsey being able to record the class lecture for her to go back and review. We may look at Kelsey being able to receive a copy of course notes, maybe using technology or an anonymous peer note taker. In college, students don't, if they get a peer note taker, they don't know who their note taker is. And that's really to protect the rights and privacy and of the student receiving the accommodation and the student who's, what's the word I'm looking for? Not influencing the accommodation, but administering the accommodation, which is taking the notes. And so Kelsey would get note taking, but then tutoring, specialized instruction is not part of accommodations. However, there is a math tutoring center on campus that's available for all students that Kelsey has access to and can utilize. A couple presentations back, we shared supports available at some of the other Idaho institutions. And I think every campus that we shared their resources on had some sort of tutoring center or learning center related to math. So it's very common on college campuses. We know students struggle with math. Number two, Troy gets up to 1 week extensions on all assignments as a current accommodation he has. Maybe he's a senior in high school. Typically in college, we know that courses go really, really quickly. And so we might try to, through the interactive process with Troy, say, okay, why do you get 1 week extensions? why does it take you longer to complete your assignments? Is it because of barriers related to the processing piece? Is it barriers related to executive functioning? Maybe we're not super great at time management and completing our assignments on time. So we might try to talk with Troy about access to his readings and assignments in advance first, so that we're not having to play catch up, but we're planning ahead. And then if appropriate, we might also do an occasional extension on assignment deadlines. Now, the big difference here is Troy's extension has now gone from 1 week to up to 48 hours at most. And in high school, Troy may not have had to tell his teachers when he needed an extension. He may have just gotten it. Whereas in college, students have to let their professors know if they're needing an extension, and it's for a disability related reason. They don't have to disclose specifics, but they do have to say, hi, professor, I'm struggling to I'm not able to get this assignment done on time. I'd like to use my accommodation of the occasional extension. When would you like to have it done by? So there has to be some communication there, and that advocacy piece is really important. And in our third example, Maria gets extra time on quizzes and exams, time unspecified. As a previous special education teacher as well, I taught middle school. I look at this and I'm like, I totally had that as an accommodation where I didn't specify how long my student got. They just got extra time. They got as long as they needed. But in college, we have to put parameters on it. And so typically we start with 1.5 extra time. And because the interactive process never ends, we might learn after Maria's first or second test, Maria calls me and she's like, Julia, I'm still running out of time. I got to question 20 of 25. And explains what was happening. I'm like, you're right, Maria. Maybe we need to do double time. So we can do longer if needed, especially students who may have physically based disabilities where they may have mobility restrictions. We can increase that time even higher if needed. So really, accommodations are reducing and removing these barriers so that students have the same opportunity for success as their peers. All right. So this is an example accommodation for our practice student, Bo Bronco, because go Broncos. And this is an example accommodation letter that we use at Boise State. Now, accommodation letters are not going to look like this at every single school, but they may look similar. So typically it has some information about the course, the semester, the student's name, who their coordinator is or who their consultant is for their accommodations, and then it will have their accommodations listed. So how we break ours up is by alternative testing, so any testing accommodations, and then instructor coordinated accommodations, which is really just a way to say like in class or course specific ones, kind of like looking at course materials, deadlines, that sort of thing. So as you can see, this is a lot shorter than a 15-page IEP. Differences between IEPs and 504s and this accommodation letter. It does not disclose the student's disability. The professors and really anyone outside of the Disability Services Office is not going to know what the student's disability is. We tell professors that they are registered with us, what their accommodations are, but not why they are connected with us. If the student chooses to disclose, that is their right, but it is not required. So unless the student shares, no one's going to know besides us. And then you'll also see that there may be some descriptions related to each accommodation. So for example, because that was something that we shared in the differences, occasional extension on assignment deadlines. As you can see that we put in here, this accommodation is to be used infrequently. If it's significantly delaying the student's progress, then the student and instructor should contact the EAC. So this is like if the student's using it every single week, if it's going beyond that 48-hour threshold, we're now at a point where the accommodation really isn't providing access. It's now inhibiting their progress in the course. And so there may be times where we need to help problem solve. There could also be assignments where the occasional extension is not appropriate. For example, group projects. Group projects, this accommodation wouldn't be appropriate because it influences and impacts the other students in the group. So really it's for that independent work. We also have some description under permission to record. So a very common note-taking accommodation is permission to record. And we have a permission to record policy that students agree to, saying, you know, they're not going to share the content of the class or the recording outside the class. They're using it for their accommodations and so on. So we like to have some descriptors. This is just an example. This is not representative of what this may look like at other universities, though. But just an example. And the timeline for requesting accommodations, we will never turn a student away. So there is no deadline that says accommodations have to be requested by October 1st or none for you. No, we accept accommodations. I just had an initial appointment with a student today and the semester ends next week. Not ideal, but again, we won't turn students away. The conversation might just look a little different. So if we're following best practice, really we want to complete that request for services. We want to initially reach out to disability services the spring or summer before the student's first semester. Housing accommodations typically need to be completed in the spring because that's when the housing applications for the campus open. So we really recommend getting housing accommodations in first. Academic accommodation typically can wait until the summer for a fall start. Now we may meet with you in the spring, but really summer is okay too. Our offices typically tend to be slower in the summer. When you meet with the coordinator, make sure to provide documentation as well. Documentation is necessary to receive accommodations. Some schools, I know most schools apply provisional accommodations up to 1 semester, sometimes 2, but beyond that, there has to be documentation received. But we don't want to be acquiring that documentation to be a barrier if it's necessary. And it's only going to take the student a couple weeks to get. Once students register for courses, which if they're coming in for their first semester, whether they're first year or a transfer, this will always happen, not always, mostly happens after orientation. So typically at orientation, students register for their courses, or once they've completed orientation, that's when they register. And so if you've already met with disability services, we recommend meeting with them again, just in case additional accommodations may need to be added. For example, you may be in a bio lab and not have thought about what accommodations you might need for the lab. And so now you're taking a biology lab and you're like, oh shoot, maybe my accommodations might look a little different. So we recommend just touching base with them. And then then you'll request accommodations for your individual classes. So just because you've registered with us does not mean that we're going to send them out. You still every semester have to request your accommodations. So for example, we have students who may request accommodations in their lectures, but not their labs because they're really good in labs because it's hands-on. Lectures where they might struggle more. Or maybe students only request accommodations in math because their learning disability only impacts math, but they don't need it in their English class. So every semester, you do not have to meet with us, most likely, but you do have to let us know which accommodations you want in which of your classes. And each school has that process clearly lined out on how to do that. So you'll request accommodations every semester, and talk with your professors about your accommodations. Students who just give their professors a heads up saying, hey, Julia sent my accommodations last week. Let me know if you have any questions. Sometimes that extra nudge is helpful because we know that professors, they're emailed these, but sometimes they may not see it right away, or it gets buried down in their emails. And so we want to make sure that communication is consistent. Now, early in the presentation, we said we do not exist at just University of Idaho and Boise State. So this is my slide proving to y'all that we're not jokesters and we're not liars. But here are all of where to get accommodations at all the Idaho schools. So as you can see, we have everyone from BYU Idaho to Boise Bible College to Lewis Clark State College. So this is hyperlinked in the presentation. And this also really captures that We may not all be named the same office, but most of us have the word access or disability in our names. So let's say that your student wants to go to Arizona State University. Obviously, we don't have Arizona State University listed on this slide, but you could look up Arizona State University accessibility office or disability services, and you will likely be able to find where to get accommodations at that school. So this is where to access in Idaho. And lastly, we are here to help. If you all ever have any questions or anything like that, please feel free to reach out to us, reach out to the schools you're interested in, and ask them about, establishing accommodations. Most info is usually on the website, but we're here to help and answer questions. Erin, Jamie, anything to add?
No, nothing. Just bring your questions if you have them. There was a question in the chat. I don't know if you saw it, Julia. There you go. About sharing the link to this presentation. I think you might have done it earlier though.
Yes, I'll share the link to the presentation right now, and then the link to the document where all of our recorded presentations from the school year are, where this recording will also be housed once it processes. Are there any, while we're all on the call, are there any questions we can help answer? Feel free to unmute yourselves or post in the chat. And thank you, Nate. Oh yeah, your guys' name changed recently, huh? Nate, I'm changing yours right now. Perfect. The presentation's refreshed, so that's changed now. Any questions? All right. I will stop the recording.